Hi, and welcome to Chapter 14, presented to you by Carly, Kelly, and Jamie. We're going to be covering ethnographic designs. You'll see the definition here given to you in our textbook from Creswell. The biggest takeaways here is that ethnographic design focuses on qualitative data, where the researcher picks up on patterns in a group of people that share some sort of culture, and that the biggest thing to focus on here is that also this has to happen over a long period of time. So basically, an ethnographer uses what we understand as qualitative research methods to observe a group of people or an event taking place within a group. This is closely tied to culture. We all understand culture to mean shared languages, rituals, communication formats, political temperatures within that culture, and so forth. So I use ethnographic design compared to other qualitative research methods. Sometimes the researcher wants to offer a more detailed depiction of a culture or the issue involved. If you simply just go into Google and type in ethnographic design, you'll see a lot of companies now are using this method to try to understand the customer to product comprehension or even to help build the business. So simply like a day seminar or a feedback link would not give the researcher or the author the level of complexity that an ethnographic design would. I think with this particular research method, it's pretty helpful to find out exactly how it developed to what it was maybe back in the 18th century to how it is now. In the 18th and 19th century, researchers like Margaret Mead started using observations and interviews to understand outside cultures. Ethnography got its roots by using this subjective lens while living amongst the research and not becoming too involved. Sociology led researchers to focus on issues rather than an entire culture. Creswell used the example of the University of Chicago studying the Jewish subculture in the 1920s, and this helped explore the lives of marginalized people. So starting in the 80s, education anthropologists started looking at classrooms and levels of education as having their own rituals and social culture and pretty much treated them as their own little mini societies. What this did for ethnographic design is it just pretty much crystallized the methods that we use now as far as looking at a culture, conducting an observation, analyzing the data, and then writing up a research report. In the late 1980s, a book called Writing Cultures was written by James Clifford and George Marcus, and they covered crises within the ethnographic design. This first crisis was the crisis of representation, which means that the perspective of a researcher cannot ever be totally objective, which led to the crisis of legitimacy of the studies, which means that basically your perspective leads naturally to wanting to compare it to your own standard. So to have a better scope, researchers should be sure to include the perspective of, say, something like feminism or racial views, sexual orientation, and other critical theories. They also need to be sensitive to gender and class issues once they give the reports. Next, we're going to get into different types of ethnographic designs. You can see in the chart that you can find in the Creswell textbook in Chapter 14. It shows that there's quite a few different ones, but we're going to focus on three different main categories, which is the realist, the case study, and the critical ethnographic design. The realist is the more traditional sense of ethnographic designs. Mostly what you need here is to understand that this is completely objective third person, and the report is as factual as possible. In the clip I have captioned here is a TED Talk with Ellen Isaacs. If you go to the link provided in the reference sheet or go to YouTube and type in Ellen Isaacs TED Talk, this will come up. Skip to about 5.5 minutes where she explains a study on parking signs and the interaction with the environment versus their intention. Even though her speech has humor, her analytical voice reflects the realist ethnographic design in our modern world. She was able to identify patterns of confusion amongst drivers by reporting strictly on the data and the behavior of the participants over a long period of time. Again, if you look in our reference sheet, you'll see the link to go directly to this YouTube. Most studies students are familiar with the term case study, and if you're not, that's going to change. Case studies differ from the traditional ethnographic design by looking at a particular instance, event, or group, compared to looking at the overall patterns of an event or group. Where ethnography perspective looks in, the case studies tend to look out. Case studies can take place on a much shorter period of time. NPR uses ethnography in a lot of the reporting. An example of a case study reported by NPR was a student working on a doctorate degree from the University of Chicago. He researched the gangs and housing projects in the 90s, and for 7 years he was undercover. His perspective reports objectively, but offers his own voice and interpretation of the culture of gangs in Chicago. He lived amongst his participants anonymously and provided detail of the rules of behavior. You will notice there are different ways a case can be used in a case study: intrinsic, instrumental, or collective. Critical ethnography makes sure to clearly define when the data is reported from the lens of the ethnographer, the participants, or for the reader. The voice is never neutral. In the Journal of Homosexuality, a study is published about a division within the Roman Catholic Church that is made up of LGBT Catholics. The author's analysis helps further the progress of dignity, the subculture being observed, and the creation of sexual minority groups to raise awareness and initiate action. In the list of references, you can also find this link and read the full article. The intent and voice of the article is very different from other examples. You can see the clear dedication to the research issue being presented.
Now that Carly has looked at the history and types of ethnographic research, we can now turn to the characteristics and ethical issues related to ethnography. The 7 characteristics of ethnographic research, as defined by Cresswell, can be broken down into 3 categories: culture, setting, and impact. For ethnographic research, definitions of the characteristic terms used are important for understanding these categories. Within the category of culture, there must be a cultural theme that's identified. This is a general position openly approved or promoted in a society or group. It is typically what field researchers are looking to describe and find examples of. Next, we have the culture sharing group, which is a group of 2 or more individuals that share behaviors, beliefs, and patterns. And last, in the culture category, we have those behaviors, beliefs, and languages. All 3 of these components must be identified within a specific cultural setting in ethnographic research. For example, Christianity is a religious belief, but it may not be a relevant belief to study ethnographically in the context of an interfaith organization of students, because it may not be a shared belief in that cultural setting. The next category of setting involves fieldwork. Fieldwork is always conducted in the participant's natural setting. In ethnography, removing the participants from their setting is to remove cultural or influential context. It is therefore inseparable from the cultural themes being studied. There are 3 types of data collected during fieldwork: emic data, that is information supplied by the participants such as language; edict data, the interpretive data supplied by the researcher; and negotiation data, which is data that is agreed upon to be used by the participant and the researcher. For example, this could include information on how a researcher is able to interact with participants, enter a site, participate in activities, etc. Next, we have the description, themes, and interpretation. Description is the contextual narrative. It is a detailed and specific identification of what is occurring with the culture sharing group within the context of the study's cultural theme. The theme is usually of edict data, that is, the coding by the researcher of different observations into related categories. And finally, the interpretation. This is the highly subjective analysis in ethnography. This aspect is where the researcher draws conclusions, relates observations back to the broader research questions and literature, and attempts to make a personal assessment. Context. Context draws on a broad sense of the factors that influence a cultural group. It can include such phenomena as history, religion, politics, economy, environment. And finally, the final category that Cresswell presents, I would define as impact. This is the researcher's ability to be reflexive in their methods. Reflexivity is the researchers acknowledging their role in a way that honors the participants, respects their identity and autonomy, as well as aims to lessen any negative impact of the researcher's presence as much as possible. The characteristic of researcher reflexivity stands out as a foundational characteristic of modern ethnographic research. As Cresswell states, this reflexivity is what leads to researchers' conclusions in ethnographic studies, often to be tentative or ambiguous rather than assertive, such as in confirming a hypothesis. This characteristic serves as a natural bridge to the consideration of ethical issues in ethnographic research, because, as Schwant points out, it forces the researcher to consider their motives, biases, and impacts not only while in the field, but in drawing conclusions. If a researcher does not seriously consider their own biases toward a group they are studying, they risk contributing to stereotypes and other harmful generalizations through their work. The following video featuring Dr. Craig of Dartmouth College highlights these ethical challenges of maintaining respect and confidentiality while also producing meaningful assessments. You will notice the intimacy involved and the importance Dr. Craig grants to the individual stories she hears. As Cresswell and Craig both preface that the majority of ethical issues in ethnographic research occur during the fieldwork stage, Howe and Doherty point out that the ethics of qualitative research involve methods and discussion of conclusions as well. This kind of intimacy and concern for those involved in the study shows how the characteristic of reflexivity is intertwined with addressing ethical issues in ethnographic research. In other words, ethical considerations do not only come up in a review board, but are a dynamic and essential part of the research process. Despite the abstract and social ways ethical issues arise with ethnographic research, Cresswell does outline several practical approaches to ethically reviewing or preparing a study. He presents the common ethical considerations into three categories. The first has to do with disclosures, which involve transparency and honesty in every aspect of the project. This includes being transparent and upfront about the purpose, the impact the study may have, as well as disclosing sources of support and funding. The second category of ethical considerations has to deal with respect. This is respect for participants and fellow researchers alike. It highlights the importance of individual stories and autonomy amongst participants. And the third category has to do with remuneration. That is, appropriate ways to contribute back to the group or community of participants for their involvement, time, and exposure. This is not to be confused with incentives, but rather represents ways in which researchers should consider the positive outcomes of their research directly on the group that they are studying.
There are many different suggested guidelines for conducting ethnographic designs. Some approaches are highly structured, such as Spradley's 12-stage developmental research sequence found in figure 14.3 on page 480 in our text. We are going to explore a general template and compare how you would apply each step in each of the three forms of ethnography. So our first step is to identify the intent of the project, appropriate design, and relate your intent to your research problem. So what this looks like for the realist ethnography is that you identify a group that shares a similar culture and develop a detailed understanding of their daily lives as it relates to a cultural theme. For a case study, you want to create an in-depth understanding of one or more individuals as it relates to an event, an activity, or a process. For critical ethnography, you want to identify a critical issue that addresses inequities and create a call to action and advocacy for that group. Step 2 is discuss approval and access considerations. So all three groups have step 2 in common. Before you begin your study, you need to receive approval from your institutional review board. Then, using purposeful sampling, identify a site for your study and a gatekeeper who will help you gain access to your participants. After that, you need to guarantee that you provide provisions for respecting the site, such as following good ethical principles, providing privacy and anonymity for the participants, informing all participants of your research, and making it clear what your purpose is and that you are not deceiving any of your participants. Step 3 is about appropriate data collection procedures. So for a realist, you're going to be entering the site slowly building rapport with the participants, and this is essential to the success of your project. You'll take field notes, observations, conduct interviews with participants, and collect artifacts that are key to understanding this particular group. For a case study, you want to collect as much data as possible. And this can come in observations, collecting numerical data, collecting documents that are related to your case, and any audiovisual material that you may want to use. For the critical ethnography, since this impacts the lives of a group, you have less emphasis spent on time in the field and the extent of the data that you collect. Instead, you actively collaborate with the participants you have selected in the data collection process, and you allow them to learn about themselves and to provide empowerment to them and lead to the lessening of oppression. Participants are active in all aspects of research, from developing the research question to helping with design, data collection, and actually writing the paper. In step 4, you're analyzing and interpreting your data within a design. So for each of these designs, you will need to analyze data for understanding and themes and interpret what that means to your study. So for realist studies, you need to develop a detailed description of the culture sharing setting, identifying cultural themes. In case studies, you're going to develop issues and themes within that one case or two cases. If there are more than one case, consider a within case analysis and then a cross case analysis. In critical ethnography, after detailing the cultural setting, you will identify themes related to the critical issue being studied and put together a plan to advocate for change. So for step 5, you're writing your report and you want to make sure that it is consistent with your design. So with realist ethnography, you keep your personal biases out of your final report, which will highlight how your study contributes to knowledge of the cultural group. Case studies, on the other hand, allow you to write a full description of the case and discuss findings by generalizing to other cases, and you may include your own biases with case studies. In a critical ethnography case, you identify the critical issue and then how you and your participants have changed during this process of studying and collecting data for this critical issue. And you want to write and report on how you have benefited from this and how your group that you are studying is going to benefit from your research. So you have now found participants, you come up with your data, you've done all of your analyzing, you decided what type of research you've done, you've studied it, you're now writing your paper, and it's finished. So what does a successful ethnography report look like? So here's a few things to consider when reviewing your paper. Does it identify a culture sharing group or case? So with this, is it clearly identifying the group and why it's important to be studying that group? Does it focus on understanding a cultural concept? So is it identifying one or more concepts that focus on how the culture sharing group really works? Does it seek to learn how the culture sharing group establishes patterns of behavior, language, and beliefs over time? So, are you collecting the data for an extended period of time, over several months to years? And are you providing as detailed of information as you possibly can about everything you observed with this group? Does it analyze multiple sources of data, including interview and observations for patterns? So you are making sure that you're collecting the multiple forms of data, which can include interviews, detailed field notes, documents, artifacts, just anything you can to really learn about that culture group that you are studying. Are you presenting data through description, theme development, and interpretations as to how the culture sharing group works? With this, you want to make sure you are identifying at least 5 to 7 themes to characterize a group to really be able to understand and interpret how this group is working. And does it reflect on his or her role in the study and how it shapes interpretation? So you're going to discuss your personal experiences with the group and how your personal experiences helped shape the themes and interpretation of this group when you were writing this paper. So if you are able to kind of answer yes to all of those questions, you have successfully completed an ethnography design and a successful paper to help people gain a better understanding of groups and what makes them work. So we hope you enjoyed our presentation.